For Thursday's lesson, our objective is to apply properties to addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division of rational numbers. These three questions are going to ask you to use these different properties. So the commutative property applies to addition or multiplication, and basically what it means is that the order of these number sentences, it doesn't actually matter. You can move the numbers in any order that you'd like them to be, as long as you're using addition or multiplication. The associative property is similar. Again, this applies to addition or multiplication, that numbers can be grouped in any way. So we could group them in parentheses any way we like, as long as we're using addition or multiplication. The distributive property, which you may or may not choose to use for question number 32, but basically the distributive property is what we did on Tuesday. Our objective was to multiply rational numbers with the distributive property, basically multiplying what's inside the parentheses by the outside. So here we multiplied 5 times 1 1/3, and so on. So the distributive property is applying, which means multiplying, the values outside of the parentheses by what's inside the parentheses. And the opposite of that would be factoring. We did a lot of work on that a couple months ago. So let's do two different example problems. Let's use the commutative property for this first one, and I'm going to show you why. So the commutative property says that if I'm adding or multiplying, that the order doesn't matter, I can move the numbers around. So let's take a look at this example here. We have 2.2 minus 1.5 plus 3.8. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm looking here, I have subtraction, here I have addition. Why would I use the commutative property if I'm not allowed to do that for subtraction? Well, hopefully some of you remember Monday's lesson where we talk about subtraction being the same as adding the opposite. So if I were you, I would first change this to adding the opposite. So now we have not a 1.5, but negative 1.5. But I still haven't moved any numbers. Now, if I wanted to move these numbers around, could I? Yes. The reason I can is because now I'm adding all three terms. Now, if I were changing the order of this equation, I would write it as 2.2 plus 3.8 plus negative 1.5. Why would I do that? Well, hopefully you can see that these two numbers, they're easily grouped together because of this decimal. If I look at 0.2 and 0.8, I know in my head that 0.2 plus 0.8 is one whole. So if I were to add these two first, 2 plus 8 is 10. Have my decimal. 1 plus 2 is 3. 3 plus 3 is 6. So these two combine for a nice, easy number of 6, or 6.0. Then my last step is to add this negative 1.5. And Mr. Boolin is coming home right now, so he's going to be a little noisy. So our last step is going to be to add 6 plus negative 1.5. Now, if you remember with rational numbers, if the signs are different, what do we need to do? Well, let's look at our rule. If the signs are the same, we will add them, then use the same sign. But if the signs are different, we actually subtract them, and then we use the sign of the greater number. So you can see here that we have two different signs. We have a positive and we have a negative. So we're actually going to subtract them. 6 minus a 1.5 is 4.5. And then I'm going to use the sign of the bigger number. So I have 6 and I have 1.5. And you can clearly see that 6 is the greater number and it's a positive. So that means that my answer becomes a positive. Our second example, we're going to be using the associative property. to be able to group these numbers in any way that we want. Now, we have to make sure that first we're using only addition or multiplication. So looking here, we have -3 times the -2.5 times -2. So we're multiplying, we're good to go. Now, in looking how I'd want to rewrite this problem, I would probably put these whole numbers next to each other because that's mental math. I can do that in my head. I don't need a calculator. So I would move the -3 next to the -2 and then times the -2.5. So my mental math says that 3 times 2 is 6. Notice that we have two negative numbers here, but we know that if they have the same sign, my answer is positive. So 3 times 2 is 6. -3 times -2 is also 6. And then all I need to do is multiply by -2.5. This one I may need to work out, and that's okay. 2.5 times 6, 13, 14, 15. I count how many decimal points I have. I have 1. So my answer is 15. Now I have a positive number and I have a negative number. So if my signs are different, then my answer is negative. So my answer here is actually -15. And by using the associative property, we are able to move the numbers and group them in different ways, so that I did 3 times -2 first, and then I multiplied by -2.5. And I could actually write it like this as well, -3 times -2 in parentheses, and then I can multiply that by a -2.5, showing that I want to do this part first. We can use the parentheses to group that. So that uses the associative property, whereas in this first example, we were using the commutative property. And remember that we can only do that when using addition or multiplication.